Today I want to talk about a study that came out and was published last month in the Times of Israel about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the carbon dating that was done on them. It's a fascinating article about a fascinating study. And if you've seen my previous video on the Old Testament canon, you already know that Catholics and Protestants have different versions of the Bible with different books in the Old Testament. One major difference is the inclusion of the Deuterocanonical books. That's Tobit, Sirach, Wisdom, Baruch, and the additions in Daniel and Esther. These books were written before the time of Jesus, and they were widely accepted by many Jews. In fact, they were part of the scriptures commonly read and referenced by Jesus himself and the apostles, the Septuagint. But something changed after the rise of Christianity. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, Jewish leaders began to distance themselves from anything that seemed to support the growing Christian movement. Since Christians were originally a sect within Judaism, this led some Jewish communities to reevaluate which books should be considered authoritative. This is where the Council of Jamnia often gets mentioned. What's clear is that over time, certain books, including the Deuterocanonical books, were de-emphasized or excluded from the developing Jewish canon in the 2nd century. Now, I'm going to mention the Dead Sea Scrolls, and if you don't know what the Dead Sea Scrolls are, it's a collection of ancient Jewish manuscripts dating from around the 3rd century BC all the way up through the 1st century AD. And it was discovered near Qumran, which is in Israel, and includes biblical texts, commentaries, and a bunch of other writings that shed light on early Judaism and the origins of Christianity. Until recently, scholars dated the Dead Sea Scrolls mainly through paleography, that is, by studying the shapes of the letters and comparing them. They would compare handwriting styles across different time periods to estimate when the scroll was written. This method can give a reasonably good estimate, but it's not precise. It lacks a firm chronological certainty. That's where this new study changes everything. The researchers, they carbon dated 30 of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That alone helped narrow down the time frame from when these scrolls were likely written. But then they took it another step and they trained an AI model, which they called Enoch. Using high-resolution images from the carbon-dated scrolls, this AI model analyzed subtle geometric figures in the handwriting, like how certain letters were formed and how they changed over time. And based on this training, Enoch was then able to estimate the dates of the additional 135 scrolls that were too fragile to test directly and had never been really properly analyzed. The goal was to avoid damaging the delicate manuscripts and still get an accurate dating, and it worked. When the researchers compared the traditional paleographic dating to the new carbon dating and the AI-based analysis, they found a strong overlap, which now, for the first time, they can date these ancient scrolls with about 80% accuracy. Now, here's the bombshell. Many of these scrolls were previously thought to be from a period called the Herodian period, which is around the 1st century BC. And they were actually from the Hasmonean period, which is earlier. Even more surprising, some of the scrolls believed to be from the Hasmonean period have now been pushed back to the 3rd century BC. This means that the Dead Sea Scrolls are even older than we thought. And why does that matter? Because it shows that books like Daniel and Ecclesiastes were in circulation almost immediately after they were composed. And that suggests they gained widespread acceptance very quickly, long before any formal canon was supposedly closed. In fact, these texts were being copied and shared throughout the Jewish communities in both Judea and the diaspora. That implies that they were widely recognized, and not some obscure writing as many Protestants claim. So what does it mean for the canon? It means that the idea that there was a fixed Jewish canon before the time of Jesus is just a myth. The reality is that different Jewish communities use slightly different collections of scripture, and the Deuterocanonical books were part of those collections. That's exactly what we find among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. And it's also why the early church, composed largely of Jews who followed Jesus, continued to use the same scriptures. Chief among them was the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which includes the Deuterocanonical books. Now, some Protestants argue that only the books accepted by the Jewish leaders after 70 AD should be considered part of the Old Testament. But this ignores a basic historical fact. There was no universally agreed upon Jewish canon before the time of Christ, and this latest research confirms it. If Deuterocanonical books were already in circulation centuries before Jesus and included in sacred libraries like Qumran, then it's impossible to argue that these books were added later by the Catholics. In fact, they were removed later by Jewish leaders trying to distance themselves from Christianity, and then by the reformers in the 16th century trying to do the same. This discovery strengthens the case for the Catholic Old Testament. It supports the idea that the early church simply continued using the sacred texts already accepted by the first Christians who were Jews. And it seriously challenges the claim that only the books approved by Jewish rabbis after the fall of the temple in 70 AD should be used by Christians today. Honestly, that is simply absurd. The Dead Sea Scrolls, including newly redated Deuterocanonical books, are extremely powerful evidence that these texts had authority before the time of Jesus. And no one can say with certainty what the exact Jewish canon was in that era. But we can say this: the early Christians didn't add these books, they received them. So if you have any doubt as to what the Jews thought before Christianity and what books they believed were inspired, let's not ask the Jews from the 2nd century. Let's ask Jesus and the apostles what they used. And they used the Septuagint, which included the Deuterocanonical books. Full stop.